Have you ever watched someone destroy something beautiful? Not with anger, not with shouting, but with the quiet, careful words of a man who has spent his entire life protecting an image? Not because he stopped caring, not because he never loved her, but because, in that single moment, the world he had built was more important than the woman standing right beside him. This is the story of Damien Voss, a self-made billionaire who rose from nothing and learned that perception is everything. And Elena Reyes, the one person who made him feel something real. It all ended on a cool spring evening at the annual Legacy Gala, one of the most exclusive events in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars. The air smelled of expensive champagne, white roses, and old money. Every conversation in the room carried weight. Every glance was measured. Damien and Elena had arrived separately, as they always did. In private, their relationship had been tender, almost fragile in its honesty. Late-night dinners at her small apartment above the flower shop, quiet mornings where he would watch her arrange bouquets with the same focus he brought to billion-dollar deals. Moments where he would rest his head on her shoulder and admit, in a voice no one else ever heard, that he was tired of performing for the world. But tonight was different. Tonight, the eyes of the entire elite circle were on him. He was on the verge of closing a landmark partnership with the Harrington Group, one of the oldest legacy families in the country. A deal that would cement his place among the untouchables, a deal that required absolute perfection in how he was perceived. Elena stood a few feet away from him, wearing a simple but elegant black dress she had chosen herself. Her dark hair was swept up softly, a few strands framing her face. She looked beautiful in that effortless way that had always quietly undone him. But to the people watching, she was just the florist. Damien felt the pressure building in his chest like a vice. He had spent weeks preparing for this night. Every handshake, every smile, every carefully chosen word was part of the performance. And Elena, the woman who had seen him at his most vulnerable, suddenly felt like a liability he could no longer afford. He guided her to a quiet corner near the large arched windows, away from the main crowd, but still visible to several key investors. The city lights sparkled behind them like a painting. For a long moment he didn't speak. Elena looked up at him, sensing something was wrong. Her eyes, always so perceptive, searched his face. "Damien," she said softly, her voice warm with concern. "You've been quiet all evening." He exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. This was the moment he had rehearsed in his head 100 times. And yet, when the words finally left his mouth, they still felt heavier than he expected. "Elena," he began, his voice low and controlled, the same tone he used in boardrooms when delivering difficult news. "I've been thinking about us, about this." He paused, choosing his words with surgical precision. "You're not what I need standing beside me right now." The sentence landed between them like a quiet blade. Elena went very still. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply absorbed the words, letting them settle deep inside her chest. Damien continued, his voice remaining calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You deserve something simpler. Someone more, aligned with your life. This world, my world, it's complicated. The optics, the expectations, I can't afford any distractions right now. Not if I want to close the Harrington deal." He looked at her, and for the briefest second something real flickered behind his eyes, regret, maybe even pain. But he pushed it down. "I care about you, Elena, I do, but this, it doesn't fit anymore." The gala continued around them. Soft laughter, clinking glasses, the low hum of power negotiations. No one was shouting. No one was making a scene, and yet, in that quiet corner, something irreversible had just happened. Elena stood there, the weight of his words pressing against her ribs. She had known this version of Damien existed, the man who prioritized image above everything. She had seen glimpses of him before, but she had hoped the man who held her at night, who whispered his fears to her, was the real one. Now she understood the truth. He had chosen. She took a slow, steady breath, her gaze never leaving his face. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the distant murmur of the Gala. Then, in a voice that was quiet, clear, and devastatingly calm, she spoke. "You didn't lose me because I wasn't enough, Damien." Her words were soft, but they cut straight through the armor he had spent years building. "You lost me because you were too afraid to stand next to me." She paused, letting the sentence settle. "And, for what it's worth, the people you're trying so hard to impress tonight have been trying to meet me all week." Damien's expression didn't change immediately. But something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of confusion, then the first slow dawn of realization. Because what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that Elena Reyes had recently received a letter from the Harrington family. They believed she might be their long-lost granddaughter. The possibility was still unconfirmed. Elena hadn't embraced it. She hadn't told anyone. She was still trying to understand what it meant for her own life. But in that moment, as the words left her lips, the quiet power in the room began to shift. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with the simple, devastating realization that the woman Damien had just pushed away might be connected to the very legacy he was desperately trying to impress. 3 months earlier, Elena Reyes's small flower shop, Bloom and Grace, sat on a quiet corner in the historic district. The storefront was modest. Whitewashed brick, large glass windows filled with fresh seasonal arrangements, and a hand-painted wooden sign that swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, the air always smelled of fresh eucalyptus, roses, and damp soil. It was a sanctuary of calm in a noisy city. Elena moved between the buckets of flowers with quiet focus, her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back in a loose bun. She was arranging a large bouquet of white lilies and pale blue hydrangeas when the bell above the door chimed. Damien Voss stepped inside. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, but his tie was loosened and the top button of his shirt undone, a small sign that he had come straight from the office. In public, he was always impeccable. Here, with her, he allowed himself to be slightly undone. "Evening," he said, his voice low and warm in a way that only she ever heard. Elena looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. "You're early tonight," she teased gently, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought billionaires worked until midnight." Damien walked over to the counter, leaning against it as he watched her work. "Even billionaires need to breathe sometimes," he replied. There was a softness in his tone that no one in his boardroom would ever recognize. With Elena, he didn't have to perform. He didn't have to calculate every word. He could simply exist. She finished tying the ribbon around the bouquet and handed it to him. "For your mother?" she asked. He nodded, taking the flowers carefully. "She'll love them." "She always does." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Damien reached across the counter and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You look tired," he said quietly, concern flickering in his eyes. "Long day?" Elena shrugged lightly. "No longer than yours, I'm sure." He studied her face for a beat longer than necessary. "Come home with me tonight," he said almost too softly. "I'll cook. No staff. Just us." Elena's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She wanted to say yes. Part of her always wanted to say yes. But she had learned to read between the lines with Damien. "Will anyone see me leaving your building in the morning?" she asked, keeping her tone light but honest. Damien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked away for a moment toward the window. "You know it's not that simple," he murmured. Elena nodded slowly, absorbing the familiar sting. "I know! She didn't push. She never did. That was one of the things he loved most about her, her emotional intelligence. She understood the world he lived in without making him feel guilty for it." Later that night, they did go to his penthouse. Not through the main entrance, through the private garage elevator that no one else used. Once inside, the masks came off. Damien kicked off his shoes, rolled up his sleeves, and actually cooked. A simple pasta dish with fresh herbs she had brought from the shop. They ate at the kitchen island, laughing about small things. He told her about a frustrating negotiation. She told him about an elderly customer who came in every week just to talk. In those moments, Damien Voss, the man who commanded billions, became just Damien, vulnerable, honest, almost free. At one point, after dinner, he pulled her close on the couch, resting his forehead against hers. "You make me forget who I'm supposed to be," he whispered. Elena closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of him. "Then maybe you don't have to be that person when you're with me," she replied softly. He didn't answer. He never did when she said things like that, because deep down he knew the truth. The world outside would never accept her the way he did in private, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough to change that. The weeks leading up to the Legacy Gala were some of the most intense of Damien Voss's life. Every morning, his private driver took him from his penthouse to the towering Voss Tower in the financial district. Every evening, he reviewed documents, attended strategy meetings, and made calls that could shift markets. But in the quiet hours, usually between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., his mind kept drifting back to Elena. He would sit in his home office, the city lights glittering far below, and replay their last private evening together. The way she had laughed when he burned the edge of the garlic bread, the way she had rested her head on his chest while they watched the rain fall against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the way she had looked at him like he was simply Damien, not the billionaire, not the self-made myth, just a man. Those memories should have brought him peace. Instead, they brought guilt. Because the closer the gala got, the clearer it became that he could not bring her. The Harrington Group, the old money legacy family he had been courting for 18 months, was notoriously traditional. They valued bloodlines, appearances, and carefully managed alliances. Their annual Legacy Gala was not just a party, it was a vetting process. Damien had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to risk everything on optics. He had come from nothing. His father had been a factory worker who drank himself to death. Damien had clawed his way up through sheer will and ruthless strategy. He knew better than anyone how quickly the elite could dismiss someone if they smelled weakness or poor breeding. Elena, with her small flower shop, her modest apartment, and her gentle, unpolished way of moving through the world, represented everything his new circle would quietly judge. So he began to pull away. Not dramatically, not with cruelty. Just distance, fewer late-night texts, shorter phone calls, excuses about work. Elena noticed, of course. She always noticed. One evening, a few days before the gala, she showed up at his private garage entrance with a small bouquet of white freesias, her favorite flower to give him because they symbolized innocence and trust. When he opened the door, she stood there in her simple coat, looking up at him with those perceptive eyes. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly. "No accusation, just truth." Damien exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not that simple, Elena." She stepped inside, setting the flowers on the console table. "Then explain it to me, because I thought we were building something real." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had never asked him for money, status, or power. The only person who had ever made him feel seen. "I'm close to something big," he said finally, his voice low. "The Harrington deal. If it goes through, it changes everything for me, for my company, for my legacy." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "And I don't fit into that picture," she said quietly. Damien didn't deny it. He couldn't. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tighter than usual. "Just give me time," he whispered against her hair. "After the gala, things will be different." Elena closed her eyes, resting her cheek against his chest. She wanted to believe him. But deep down, she already knew the truth. He was choosing, and she was not the choice. 2 days before the gala, Elena received the letter. It arrived in a thick cream envelope with the Harrington family crest embossed on the back. The message inside was polite, but direct. The Harrington family had been conducting private genealogical research. They believed she might be the granddaughter of their late patriarch, Elias Harrington, from a brief relationship he had decades ago that was never publicly acknowledged. DNA testing had been suggested. A meeting had been offered. Elena sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at the letter. She felt no excitement, only a strange, hollow confusion. She had grown up believing she was ordinary. Adopted by kind but struggling parents who had passed away years ago, she had built her life with her own hands. The flower shop, her small apartment, her quiet routines. Now, this letter suggested her blood might carry one of the most powerful names in the country. She didn't tell Damien. She wasn't even sure she believed it yet. And part of her, a quiet, stubborn part, didn't want it to matter. If he couldn't stand beside her as the florist she was, then what was the point of being anything more? The night of the gala. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors. Waiters moved silently with trays of vintage champagne. The air hummed with power, old money mingling with new ambition. Damien arrived alone, as planned. Elena arrived 30 minutes later, as they had agreed. She looked elegant in her simple black dress, but she carried herself with the same quiet grace she had in her flower shop. No pretense, no performance. Damien spotted her immediately. His chest tightened. She was beautiful, but in this room, beauty wasn't enough. Perception was everything. He moved toward her through the crowd, his face carefully composed. When he reached her, he didn't take her hand, he didn't touch her. Instead, he leaned in slightly and spoke in a low, controlled voice that only she could hear. "Elena, we need to talk." He guided her to a quiet alcove near the large windows, away from the main crowd, but still visible to several key Harrington representatives. The conversation that followed was quiet, civilized, devastating. "Elena, you're not what I need standing beside me right now." His words were measured, almost gentle. "You deserve something simpler, someone more aligned with your life. This world, my world, it demands perfection in how I'm perceived. The Harrington deal is too important. I can't afford any complications." Elena stood very still. She felt the words sink into her like cold water. She had known this version of him existed, but hearing it spoken so calmly, so rationally, still hurt more than she expected. She looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had held her at night. The man who had whispered his fears to her. The man who was now choosing his image over her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice that was soft, steady, and filled with quiet strength, she replied, "You didn't lose me because I wasn't enough, Damien." She paused, letting the words settle between them. "You lost me because you were too afraid to stand next to me." Damien's expression remained controlled, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor. Elena continued, her tone never rising. "And for what it's worth, the people you're trying so hard to impress tonight have been trying to meet me all week." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to, because at that exact moment, an older gentleman from the Harrington family, Mr. Theodore Harrington himself, walked past the alcove. He paused. His eyes landed on Elena. Recognition flickered across his face. "Miss Reyes," he said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. "I've been hoping to speak with you. The family has been waiting for this moment." The ripple started small. Then it spread, quietly, inevitably. Damien stood frozen. The woman he had just pushed away, the woman he believed was a liability, was suddenly being acknowledged by the very family he had spent months trying to impress. The power in the room had shifted, not with shouting, not with revenge, but with the quiet, devastating realization that he had chosen perception over something real, and now it was gone. The silence that followed Eleanor's words was louder than any shout could have been. Theodore Harrington stood a few feet away, his silver hair catching the golden light of the chandeliers. His expression was one of genuine surprise and quiet recognition. "Miss Reyes," he said again, his voice carrying across the small space with the natural authority of old money. "We've been looking for you for quite some time. The family would very much like to speak with you privately this evening, if you're open to it." Several heads turned. Conversation slowed. The ripple moved outward like a stone dropped into still water. Damien Voss stood completely still. For the first time in years, the man who had built an empire on control felt the ground shift beneath him. He looked at Elena, really looked at her. The woman he had held in his arms only nights ago, the woman who had listened to his fears without judgment, the woman he had just told, calmly, rationally, coldly, that she was not what he needed, standing beside him. Now she stood there with the same quiet dignity she always carried in her flower shop, surrounded by elite guests who were suddenly seeing her differently. Elena turned her gaze back to Damien. There was no triumph in her eyes, no anger, only a deep, clear sadness mixed with something that looked almost like pity. "You didn't lose me because I wasn't enough," she said again, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "You lost me because you were too afraid to stand next to the real me." She took one slow step back. "I hope the Harrington deal goes exactly the way you want it to, Damien." With that, she turned and walked away. Not dramatically, not with tears. She simply walked with the sane, graceful, grounded steps she used when arranging flowers in her shop. Theodore Harrington offered her his arm politely, and she accepted it with a small, gracious nod. They moved toward a private lounge at the far end of the ballroom. The crowd parted slightly. Whispers followed. Damien remained rooted in place. His carefully constructed world, the one he had sacrificed everything to build, suddenly felt paper-thin. He had spent years learning that perception was currency. Tonight, he had paid the highest price for it. Later, that night, Damien stood alone on the private balcony of his penthouse. The city stretched out below him like a sea of lights. The gala had continued without him. He had left shortly after Elena walked away, citing urgent business. Now, the silence of his empty apartment pressed in on him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. Instead, he stared at the bouquet of white freesias Elena had given him days earlier. They were still sitting on the console table, beginning to wilt. He picked up his phone and opened the last message she had sent him 2 days ago. A simple photo of her arranging flowers with the caption, "Thinking of you. Come by the shop when you can breathe again." He had never replied. Now he typed a message, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. Finally, he put the phone down. For the first time in his adult life, Damien Voss didn't know what to say, because there was nothing he could say that would undo the moment he had chosen his image over her. 3 days later, Elena stood in her flower shop, surrounded by the familiar scent of fresh blooms. The letter from the Harrington family still sat on her small desk in the back room. She hadn't decided yet what she would do with it. Part of her wanted to ignore it completely. Another part of her was curious. But the largest part of her simply felt tired, not from the flower shop, not from the long hours, but from the quiet realization that the man she had allowed herself to care for had chosen comfort over courage. The bell above the door chimed. She looked up. Damien stood in the doorway. He looked different. The sharp edges were still there, the tailored suit, the confident posture, but something in his eyes had changed. He looked smaller. "Elena," he said quietly. She didn't move from behind the counter. "Damien!" He took a few steps inside, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm not here to ask you to take me back," he said, his voice low and careful. "I know I don't deserve that." He paused, searching for words. "I came to tell you that I was wrong." Elena watched him silently. "I was afraid," he continued. "Afraid that if I brought you into my world publicly, people would see the parts of me I've spent years trying to hide, the parts that came from nothing, the parts that still feel like they don't belong." He looked down at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I chose perception over you, over us. and I lost something real because of it." Elena absorbed his words. She felt the ache in her chest, the same ache she had carried since the gala. But she also felt clarity. "You didn't just lose me that night," she said gently. "You lost the version of yourself that I fell for. The one who didn't need to perform." Damien nodded slowly. "I know." There was a long silence between them. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with everything that could have been. Elena finally spoke again. "I received a letter from the Harrington family. They think I might be connected to them. I haven't decided what I'm going to do with that yet. But even if it turns out to be true, it doesn't change who I am. I'm still the same person who runs this shop, who likes quiet mornings and fresh flowers." She looked at him with quiet strength. "And I deserved someone who could stand next to that version of me without shame." Damien's eyes glistened. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply nodded. "I understand." He took one step closer, then stopped. "I hope you find whatever makes you happy, Elena. You deserve it more than anyone I've ever known." He turned to leave. At the door, he paused. Without turning around, he said softly, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Then he walked out. The bell above the door chimed once more. Elena stood alone in her flower shop, surrounded by the scent of roses and lilies. She felt the weight of the moment settle, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet, bittersweet closure. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had not needed to humiliate him. She had simply been herself, and that had been enough. Power is rarely loud. Sometimes it speaks in the quietest voice in the room. Sometimes it wears a simple black dress and carries the scent of fresh flowers. Sometimes the greatest loss isn't the deal that fell through. It's the person you pushed away because you were too afraid to stand beside them. Damien Voss learned that lesson the hard way. He chose perception over truth, image over honesty, control over courage, and in doing so, he lost something far more valuable than any business alliance. Elena Reyes walked away with her dignity intact. She didn't need to become louder to be heard. She didn't need to become richer to matter. She simply needed to remain true to herself. And that quiet strength was the most powerful thing in the room that night. Remember this, the person you're afraid to stand beside today might be the one you'll regret losing tomorrow. Because real connection doesn't care about optics, it only cares about courage. And courage is rarer than wealth. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe to Veiled Flame for more quiet, powerful stories every week. See you in the next one.